August 19, 1944. 31,000 feet above the Japanese home islands, Staff Sergeant Robert Whitman sat in the upper forward gun turret of a B-29 Superfortress, watching a Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony fighter climb toward his formation. The Japanese pilot was good, really good, positioning himself for a classic 12 o'clock high attack that had been shredding American bomber formations over Europe for 2 years. Whitman's hands moved to his gun controls, his instincts screaming at him to track the fighter, center it in his crosshairs, and fire. Every fiber of his being, honed through months of gunnery training, told him to aim directly at what he could see. Instead, he did something that felt completely insane. He aimed behind the fighter, not a little behind. A full 3 aircraft lengths behind, pointing his twin 50 caliber machine guns at empty sky where the Japanese plane had been 2 seconds ago. Then he pressed the trigger. 600 rounds per minute, started screaming out of his guns toward absolutely nothing. The Tony continued its attack run, seemingly oblivious, closing the distance to the bomber formation at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. Then, as if by magic, the fighter flew directly into Whitman's stream of tracers. The Japanese plane staggered, pieces tearing off its wing, smoke erupting from the engine cowling. It rolled, inverted, and fell away, trailing fire. Whitman had just shot down an enemy fighter by aiming at where it wasn't, and he'd done it using a targeting system so counterintuitive that it took pilots months to trust it, even after seeing it work with their own eyes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The B-29 Superfortress represented the most technologically advanced bomber ever built when it entered service in 1944. It could fly higher than any fighter could effectively pursue it, travel farther than any previous bomber, and carry more ordnance than entire squadrons of earlier aircraft. But all of that capability meant nothing if Japanese fighters could shred the formations before they reached their targets. And in the summer of 1944, that's exactly what was happening. The problem wasn't the B-29's defensive armament. Each Superfortress bristled with 12 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, plus a 20mm cannon in the tail. That was more firepower than any bomber in history. The problem was that the guns were essentially useless against fighters attacking at the closing speeds the B-29's altitude and velocity created. A Japanese Ki-84 Frank, or Ki-61, Tony fighter attacking a B-29 formation head-on would have a closing speed of roughly 600 miles per hour. That translated to 880 feet per second. In the time it took a 50 caliber round to travel 1,000 feet, the fighter had moved another 800 feet closer. If a gunner aimed directly at a fighter attacking from 2,000 feet out, by the time his bullets reached that spot, the fighter would be 3,000 feet closer, nowhere near the bullet stream. The numbers were even worse for beam attacks, where fighters came in from the side. A fighter moving at 300 miles per hour perpendicular to the bomber's flight path was covering 440 feet per second. 50 caliber rounds left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second, but they didn't maintain that velocity. Air resistance at 30,000 feet altitude, where the air was thinner but still present, slowed the rounds significantly. By the time a bullet traveled 1,500 feet laterally, it had lost roughly 30% of its initial velocity and had dropped several feet due to gravity. Meanwhile, the target fighter had moved 660 feet from where it was when the gunner pulled the trigger. The geometry was nightmare fuel for anyone who understood ballistics. Experienced gunners from B-17 and B-24 units, men who'd flown combat missions over Europe, found themselves completely ineffective when they transferred to B-29 units in the Pacific. Their hard-won instincts, their ability to lead targets by feel, their practiced eye for deflection shooting, all of it was calibrated for attacks at lower altitudes and slower closing speeds. The B-29 operated in a different environment entirely, where the old rules didn't just fail, they guaranteed failure. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, who would later pilot the Enola Gay, flew some of the earliest B-29 combat missions in 1944 and wrote detailed reports about the gunnery problem. His observations were blunt. Our gunners are brave, well-trained, and utterly ineffective. They're firing thousands of rounds per mission and hitting nothing. Japanese fighters are pressing attacks to point-blank range because they've figured out our defensive fire is mostly for show. We're losing aircraft not because our guns don't work, but because our gunners can't hit what they're aiming at. The Army Air Forces had anticipated this problem during the B-29's development, and they'd created a solution that was, at the time, the most sophisticated fire control system ever installed in an aircraft. It was called the Central Fire Control System, and it was built around an analog computer that weighed nearly 50 pounds and performed calculations that would have taken a trained mathematician several minutes to solve by hand. The CFC system did those calculations continuously, 30 times per second, automatically adjusting for airspeed, altitude, temperature, the ballistic characteristics of the ammunition, and most critically, the relative motion between the bomber and the attacking fighter. Here's how it was supposed to work. The gunner would track the attacking fighter with his sight, keeping the target centered in the crosshairs. The sight was connected to a gyroscopic computing sight that measured the rate at which the gunner was moving his controls to follow the target. That rate of movement, combined with range information from an optical rangefinder, told the computer how fast the target was moving relative to the bomber. The computer would then calculate the exact lead angle required, the amount of deflection needed to ensure that bullets and target arrived at the same point in space. Then, and this was the revolutionary part, the computer would automatically offset the guns from where the sight was pointing. The gunner would see the target centered in his crosshairs, but the actual gun barrels would be pointing at a computed impact point somewhere ahead of, behind, or to the side of where the sight was aimed. The gunner was aiming at the target, but the guns were aiming at the future. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it required gunners to do something that violated every instinct they possessed. They had to trust the machine. The resistance started during training. Gunnery schools in the United States spent months trying to teach crews how to use the Central Fire Control System, and they ran into psychological barriers that nobody had anticipated. Sergeant Harold Morrison, who trained at Lowry Field in Colorado in early 1944, later described the experience with obvious frustration. They'd show us the system, explain how it worked, tell us to just track the target and let the computer do the rest. Then they'd take us up for live fire exercises against towed sleeves, target drones, the whole setup. And every single time, guys would track the target, squeeze the trigger, and then immediately jerk their controls to try to correct where they saw their tracers going. They couldn't help it. You'd see your bullets going behind the target, or in front of it, or off to the side, and your brain would scream that you were missing. So you'd try to correct, which completely screwed up the tracking data the computer needed. The computer was pointing the guns exactly where they needed to be, and the gunners were fighting it every step of the way. The problem was the tracers. Every fifth round in a .50 caliber ammunition belt was a tracer, a bullet with a pyrotechnic compound in its base that burned bright enough to see in daylight. Tracers were supposed to help gunners see where their bullets were going and adjust their aim accordingly. But with the Central Fire Control System, tracers became a source of constant confusion. A gunner would track a target, fire, and watch his tracers stream past behind the fighter or off to one side. His eyes told him he was missing. His instinct told him to adjust. And every time he adjusted, he disrupted the tracking solution the computer needed to calculate the correct lead. The gunnery instructors tried everything. They removed tracers entirely from training ammunition, forcing gunners to fire blind and trust the system. That helped somewhat, but it was impractical for combat where tracers served other purposes, like signaling other gunners which targets were already being engaged. They ran endless ground school sessions explaining the mathematics, showing diagrams of relative velocity and bullet flight time. That worked for the intellectually curious gunners who enjoyed mathematics, but did nothing for the majority, who just wanted to shoot straight and didn't care about the calculus behind it. Some instructors tried a different approach. They'd have gunners practice with the Central Fire Control System disabled, firing manually just like they would in a B-17. The gunners would track targets, apply what they thought was the right amount of lead, and fire. The results were filmed. Then they'd run the same exercise with the CFC system active and compare the footage. The difference was stark enough that it started changing minds. Manual fire produced scatter patterns that occasionally, randomly, intersected with the target drone. CFC-directed fire produced consistent hits, the kind of concentrated bursts that would shred an actual fighter. The statistical proof was building, but statistics don't override instinct easily. By May of 1944, when B-29 units started deploying to bases in India and China for the first bombing missions against Japan, fewer than 40% of gunners consistently trusted their central fire control systems. The majority would start a tracking solution, lose confidence when they saw where the bullets appeared to be going, and revert to manual aiming. Combat would either validate the system or prove it was an expensive failure. The first B-29 combat mission targeting the Japanese home islands launched on June 15, 1944. 68 superfortresses took off from bases in China to bomb the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata. Japanese fighters rose to meet them, and for the first time, the central fire control system faced its real test. The results were mixed and deeply frustrating. Gunners who trusted their systems, who tracked targets without trying to manually correct their aim, were scoring hits. The gun camera footage showed bullets impacting fighters in ways that shouldn't have been possible with manual fire. But these successful engagements were the minority. Most gunners, when faced with fighters attacking at closing speeds they'd never experienced in training, reverted to their instincts. They saw where their tracers were going, panicked, and started aiming manually. Their hit rate was virtually zero. The mission reports told a contradictory story. Some crews reported that the new fire control system was incredible, that they'd damaged or destroyed fighters that would have been impossible to hit otherwise. Other crews reported that the system was useless, that they'd fired thousands of rounds without effect. The difference wasn't the equipment. Every B-29 had the same CFC system. The difference was whether the gunner believed in it enough to use it properly. Lieutenant General Curtis LeMay, who would soon take command of the B-29 operations in the Pacific, read the initial mission reports and identified the problem immediately. He'd been an advocate for automated fire control since his days commanding B-17 units in Europe, where he'd seen firsthand how manual gunnery failed at high closing speeds. His assessment was characteristically blunt. The system works. The gunners don't trust it. That's a training problem, not an equipment problem. We need to break them of the habit of thinking their eyes and hands are smarter than mathematics. LeMay initiated a brutal retraining program for B-29 crews in the summer of 1944. Gunners who'd already completed their training stateside went through additional gunnery courses in the combat theatre. The approach was different from what they'd experienced before. Instead of explanations and theory, the training focused on repetition and proof. Gunners practiced against fighter aircraft that made actual attack runs, not just flew predictable patterns. They were forced to track aggressively maneuvering targets while instructors stood behind them, physically preventing them from making manual corrections. The instruction was simple and repeated endlessly. Center the target, maintain smooth tracking, ignore your tracers, trust the system. The breakthrough came not from training exercises, but from combat itself. On July 7, 1944, a formation of B-29 seconds from the 58th Bombardment Wing encountered heavy fighter opposition over Sasebo. One of the bombers, piloted by Captain Howard Jarrell, had a crew that included Staff Sergeant Thomas Griffin in the upper forward turret. Griffin had been one of the skeptical gunners, a man who'd flown combat missions in B-24 seconds over Europe and trusted his own instincts more than any computer. But during this mission, with Japanese fighters pressing attacks from every angle, something clicked. He later wrote about the moment in a letter home that was widely circulated among B-29 crews. I was tracking this Oscar fighter coming in from 10 o'clock high, and I could see my tracers going way behind him. Every instinct told me to lead more, to point my guns ahead of where he was. But I remembered the instructor at Pratt Field, this captain who kept saying, "The computer knows, you don't." So I kept the fighter centered in my sight, kept my tracking smooth, and just held the trigger down. And I watched Oscar fly right into my bullet stream, just flew into it, like he'd decided to ram my bullets instead of my plane. Pieces started coming off, and he rolled away, trailing smoke. I didn't aim ahead of him. I aimed right at him, and the computer put the bullets where they needed to be. I don't understand it, but I believe it now. Griffin's letter got passed around, and more importantly, his gun camera footage got shown at every bomber base. Seeing one of their own, a combat veteran who'd been openly skeptical, successfully using the system exactly as designed, had more impact than any training lecture could achieve. By September of 1944, B-29 gunners were beginning to consistently trust their central fire control systems, and Japanese fighter pilots were noticing the difference. The turning point came during a series of raids in October and November when B-29 formations demonstrated a level of defensive effectiveness that shocked both American planners and Japanese commanders. On November 24, 1944, a formation of 88 B-29 seconds attacked the Nakajima aircraft plant in Tokyo. It was the first major daylight raid on the Japanese capital, and Japanese fighter units threw everything they had at the bombers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content. Like this. The Japanese threw over 100 fighters at that formation. Ki-84 Franks, Ki-61 Tonys, A6 M0s, even some of the newer Ki-100 seconds that were supposed to be specifically designed for high-altitude interception. They attacked from every angle, using tactics that had worked against B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds over Europe. Head-on passes, beam attacks, diving attacks from above, everything in the playbook. The B-29 gunners, most of them now fully committed to their central fire control systems, tracked targets with steady precision. They kept fighters centered in their sights, maintained smooth tracking, and let the computers calculate the lead. The results were devastating for the Japanese. Gun camera footage from that mission shows fighter after fighter flying directly into streams of .50 caliber fire. Not near the fire, not through scattered shots, but directly into concentrated bursts that had been placed exactly where the fighters would be a fraction of a second later. The Japanese pilots were experiencing something they'd never encountered before. American gunners who could hit them during high-speed attack runs. Hits that came from angles that shouldn't have been possible. Defensive fire that was accurate enough to force them to break off attacks before reaching effective range. The mission statistics told the story. Of the 88 B-29 seconds that attacked Tokyo that day, only 2 were lost to fighter action. The bombers claimed 17 confirmed fighter kills, and another 33 damaged. Those numbers were later revised downward by intelligence analysis, the way all combat claims were. But even the conservative estimates showed something remarkable. B-29 formations were now capable of defending themselves against massed fighter attacks in ways that previous bombers simply couldn't match. The central fire control system, when used properly, had turned the defensive gunnery equation completely around. Instead of fighters being able to press attacks to point-blank range against ineffective defensive fire, they now had to respect the bomber's defensive envelope or risk being shredded. Japanese fighter commanders noticed. Post-war interrogations of Japanese pilots revealed that by late 1944, fighter units had been instructed to avoid prolonged attacks on B-29 formations unless they had overwhelming numerical superiority. The standing orders were to make 1 pass, maybe 2, and break off if they didn't achieve a quick kill. The B-29 seconds defensive fire was too accurate to allow for the kind of persistent attacks that had worked against B-17 seconds. One Japanese pilot, Captain Yasuhiko Kuroe, who flew Ki-84 Franks against B-29 formations throughout late 1944 and early 1945, described the experience in post-war interviews. The American gunners had learned something new. When we attacked, their fire was incredibly accurate, not scattered like it had been in the early missions. You could see the tracers, tracking you, following your movements, and if you held your attack run too long, you'd fly right into them. It was as if they could predict where you'd be. We started making very fast passes and breaking away immediately. Staying in range of those bombers for more than a few seconds was suicide. The psychological impact on Japanese fighter pilots was significant. They'd been trained to be aggressive, to press attacks home regardless of defensive fire. That worked when defensive fire was inaccurate. But against B-29 formations with gunners who'd learned to trust their central fire control systems, aggression became a liability. Pilots who pressed attacks found themselves flying into bullet streams that seemed to materialize exactly where they were going. The defensive fire was no longer something to fly through, it was something to actively avoid. By January of 1945, when B-29 operations shifted from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks on Japanese cities, the gunnery lessons had been thoroughly absorbed. Curtis LeMay's decision to send B-29 seconds in at 5,000 to 8,000 feet instead of 30,000 feet was partially based on confidence in the bomber's defensive capabilities. The lower altitude meant Japanese fighters would have an easier time intercepting, but it also meant B-29 gunners would have even more time to track and engage targets. The closing speeds would be lower, the air denser for better bullet performance, and the central fire control systems would have slightly simpler calculations to make. The incendiary raids proved the point. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, 325 B-29 seconds attacked Tokyo in the single most destructive air raid of World War II. Japanese fighters managed to shoot down 14 bombers, a loss rate of just over 4%. Given the scale of the attack, the low altitude, and the fact that Japanese fighters had every advantage, that loss rate was remarkably low. The defensive gunnery, combined with the confusion caused by the massive fires below, made it nearly impossible for Japanese fighters to effectively engage the bomber stream. The technical details of why the central fire control system worked the way it did are worth understanding, because they reveal just how sophisticated the engineering was. The heart of the system was the General Electric G-1 computing gun sight, an analog computer that used mechanical components, gyroscopes, and electrical circuits to perform ballistic calculations. When a gunner tracked a target, the sight measured the angular rate of movement in 3 dimensions: elevation, azimuth, and range. The gyroscopes stabilized the sight against the bomber's own movements, ensuring that what was being measured was the target's movement relative to a stable reference frame, not the bomber's random pitching and rolling. The computer took that angular rate data and combined it with information about the bomber's airspeed, which came from the airspeed indicator, the bomber's altitude, which came from the altimeter, the outside air temperature, which affected bullet velocity, and the ballistic characteristics of the ammunition, which were hardwired into the computer's mechanical components. All of this data was processed through a series of cams, gears, and electrical potentiometers that solved the ballistic equations mechanically. The output was a set of electrical signals that drove motors attached to the gun turrets. These motors physically moved the guns off-axis from where the sight was pointing, creating the lead angle needed for bullets and target to intersect. The genius of the system was that it made the correct solution automatic and invisible to the gunner. The gunner didn't need to understand differential equations or ballistic coefficients. He just needed to keep the target centered in his sight and maintain smooth tracking. The computer did everything else. But that invisibility was also what made the system so hard for gunners to trust. They couldn't see the calculations being performed. They couldn't see why their guns were pointing away from where their sight was aimed. All they could see was tracers going past the target, and every instinct told them they were missing. The training evolution that finally solved the trust problem was surprisingly simple. Gunnery instructors started using a technique where they'd have gunners track targets with their sights, but the guns themselves wouldn't fire. The instructors would film the target and mark where the guns were pointing. Then they'd develop the film and show the gunners frame by frame that the guns had been pointed exactly where the target ended up being. Seeing the prediction accuracy in slow motion, watching the computer correctly anticipate the target's future position over and over again, finally broke through the psychological barrier. The gunners could see that. The computer wasn't guessing, it was calculating, and its calculations were provably correct. By the spring of 1945, B-29 gunners had become some of the most effective defensive gunners in aviation history, not because they had better reflexes or sharper eyes than gunners in other bombers, but because they'd learned to subordinate their instincts to mathematics. They'd learned that their eyes could be fooled, that their instincts could be wrong, but the ballistic equations were always correct. A fighter moving at 300 miles per hour would always be in a specific position, a half-second from now. And if you fired bullets that would arrive at that position at that exact moment, physics guaranteed a hit. The computer could calculate that. The human gunner couldn't, at least not fast enough to matter. The impact extended beyond just the B-29 program. The lessons learned about automated fire control influenced post-war development of air-to-air missiles, radar-guided, gun systems, and eventually the computerized fire control systems used in modern combat aircraft. The basic principle remained the same. Human operators provide target designation and tracking. Computers handle the ballistic calculations and weapon pointing. The B-29's central fire control system was primitive by modern standards, but it established the template that every subsequent system would follow. There's a broader lesson here about technology and human psychology. The most sophisticated technology in the world is useless if the people using it don't trust it enough to use it properly. The B-29's fire control system worked perfectly from day one. The problem was never the technology. It was convincing human beings to trust their lives to calculations they couldn't verify in real time. That required not just training, but combat proof. Gunners needed to see other gunners succeed using the system. They needed to watch gun camera footage showing impossible hits. They needed statistics showing that computer-aimed guns hit targets at 10 times the rate of manually aimed guns. Even then, the transition wasn't universal or immediate. Some gunners never fully trusted the system and continued trying to manually correct their aim throughout the war. But enough gunners made the psychological leap that B-29 formations became effectively defended against Japanese fighter attacks by mid-1945. The Japanese response was telling. They largely stopped trying to fight the B-29 seconds in the air and instead focused on building up anti-aircraft artillery defenses and developing specialized ramming tactics for desperate pilots. The conventional fighter attack had become too costly. Staff Sergeant Robert Whitman, the gunner from the opening of this story, flew 35 combat missions in B-29 seconds before the war ended. He was credited with 3 confirmed fighter kills and 5 damaged, which made him one of the more successful B-29 gunners. In a post-war interview, conducted in 1946, he reflected on the experience of learning to aim behind the target. "The hardest thing I ever had to learn in the military wasn't how to shoot," he said. "It was how to stop shooting the way I'd been taught my whole life. Every time you shoot at something, whether it's a duck or a clay pigeon or a target on a range, you learn to lead it. You learn to aim ahead of where it is. The B-29 system turned that completely backwards. You aimed at the target, and the computer aimed ahead of it, or behind it, or to the side. Whatever direction the math said was correct. And you had to trust that the math was right even when your eyes told you it was wrong." He paused, then added something that gets to the heart of why this story matters. "The thing is, your eyes are always wrong when things are moving that fast. Human perception isn't built for targets closing at 600 miles per hour. We evolved to hunt animals that move at maybe 30 miles per hour at their absolute fastest. Our brains literally can't process the calculations fast enough to manually aim at something moving 20 times faster than anything our ancestors ever hunted. The computer could, though, and once we learned to get out of the computer's way and let it do what it was built to do, we could hit things that should have been impossible to hit. That's the real story of the B-29 gunners who learned to fire behind the target. It's not about a trick or a technique. It's about the moment in warfare when human skill had to give way to computational precision, when instinct, no matter how finely honed, became obsolete in the face of mathematical certainty. The gunners who succeeded weren't the ones with the best reflexes or the sharpest eyes. They were the ones who could accept that their own perception was fundamentally inadequate for the task, and trust a machine to see the future they couldn't. The central fire control system represented one of the earliest examples of human-computer collaboration in combat, and it established a pattern that would define the next 80 years of military technology. Humans make decisions, identify targets, and provide judgment. Computers handle calculations, precision, and speed. The partnership works, but only when humans are humble enough to recognize the limits of their own capabilities and trust the math. By August of 1945, when the war ended, B-29 formations had flown over 33,000 combat sorties. Japanese fighters had made thousands of attacks against those formations. The loss rate to fighter action remained below 5% throughout the campaign, remarkable for high-value strategic bombers operating in hostile airspace. The central fire control system didn't make B-29 seconds invulnerable, but it made them survivable in ways that previous bombers weren't. And it did so not by making gunners better shots, but by making them willing to let a computer do the shooting for them. The B-29 program cost $3 billion, which was more expensive than the Manhattan Project. A significant portion of that cost went into the defensive systems, the central fire control computers, the remotely operated turrets, the gyroscopic sights. Critics argued that the money could have been better spent on additional fighter escorts or improved armor. But the combat results validated the investment. B-29 seconds could defend themselves in situations where escorts weren't available and where armor wouldn't have mattered. They could do it because their gunners learned to aim at empty sky and trust that mathematics would put their bullets exactly where they needed to be. That trust didn't come naturally. It had to be trained, demonstrated, proved in combat, and reinforced through hundreds of missions. But once it took hold, it changed the nature of aerial gunnery forever. The days of the natural-born gunner, the man who could shoot by instinct and feel, were over. The future belonged to operators who could track targets smoothly and let computers solve problems that human brains simply weren't fast enough to handle. Robert Whitman never saw the Japanese fighter that his bullets hit on that August day in 1944. He was aiming behind it, watching his tracers stream into empty sky, trusting a 50-pound analog computer to predict where the fighter would be a fraction of a second later. That computer was right. His instincts were wrong. And the lesson learned in that moment, the hard lesson that took months and cost lives, became the foundation for every computer-aided weapons system that followed. The B-29 gunners didn't just learn a new technique. They learned to trust mathematics over instinct, calculation over feel, and precision over perception. They learned that sometimes the right answer looks wrong until physics proves otherwise. And they learned that lesson 30,000 feet above Japan, firing at targets they couldn't reliably hit with their eyes, but could hit perfectly by trusting a machine to do what humans couldn't. That's worth remembering. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.